Hey everyone, and welcome to the Project Censored Radio Show. I don't believe that I need to introduce who I'm talking to because for the first time in quite a while, co-host Mickey Huff and I, Eleanor Goldfield, are sitting down to have a conversation.
It's amazing, Eleanor, and it's a delight to talk to you, quote unquote, live on air here, just to talk about media freedom issues. You know, a lot of the things we do on the Project Censored show, as our listeners know, when they hear you or they hear me interviewing guests and having segments, the common thread is the news that doesn't make the news, things the corporate media either don't cover at all or cover poorly or in a distorted manner or with a lot of spin. And there's no shortage of content. And one of the other things we've done at Project Censored over the last couple of years in our books and of course, on the show is we've talked about the perilous state of affairs for journalists. Journalists under assault. And in fact, Eleanor, maybe we can just kick off briefly by having you remind our listeners, you've done a couple incredible segments and a fantastic op-ed over at Truth Out some time ago on the attack on the free press and journalists in Asheville, North Carolina. And
Yeah,
unfortunately,
absolutely.
we have another horrible case in Marion in Kansas. So we have a couple things we can talk about here to share with our audience that just because we live in the United States and have purported free press protections under the First Amendment, that's not always how these things are practiced in the real world, in the world of journalism. And, not to carte blanche sort of put a big blanket over law enforcement or a state apparatus. But many in these institutions don't respect press freedoms or are unaware of where the lines of protection are, and sometimes they cross them in very egregious ways. So, Eleanor, maybe you can remind our listeners a little bit about that case and maybe kick off the Marion case.
Yeah, absolutely, Mickey. So I think at the core of this issue is who gets to decide who is a journalist, who gets to decide what a free press really is. And constitutionally speaking, that decision should not be up to people in authority, whether that be police or magistrates or judges, or it is really a matter of having a free press requires there to be no ability of whoever's in that uniform or at that judge's chair at the time to make that decision. Otherwise, you don't have access to a free press. And this is also something that, listeners might be familiar with, or you very likely familiar with Kevin Gosztola, a frequent guest on the show, who Mickey often talks to about the Assange case, and who has a book out with the Censored Press. And for those of you listening, we will soon have video available from an event with Kevin Gosztola. And so that is the State Department and the CIA deciding whether Julian Assange is a journalist. Well, that is also unacceptable, strictly constitutionally speaking, not just my personal opinion. And so at the crux of this, it is who gets to decide who is a journalist and how does that affect our freedom of press? And Mickey, you were referencing the case in Asheville, which right now both journalists Matilda Bliss and Veronica Coit are appealing a decision that was in fact the first of its kind in the history of the United States to find two people guilty of journalism. And folks can listen to those interviews that I did with Matilda Bliss and Veronica Coit. And as Mickey mentioned, there's an article on Truth Out. And there were echoes. There have been echoes that have persisted around the country. And this one that Mickey already referenced is from earlier this month in August. Early August, a 98-year-old Kansas newswoman died in the line of duty after a police raid. That's the headline from the Kansas City Star newspaper.
I mean, that's atrocious. And one of the, the many organizations, of course, have press freedom organizations have rightfully called this an atrocious assault, not just on press freedom, but given that this 98-year-old woman, the publisher of this newspaper died the day after what is an illegal police raid, right? Their alleged warrant permission was rescinded by a judge. And again, you mentioned Kevin Gosztola at the dissenter.org. Kevin covers these kinds of issues. He certainly has been on this one already. But that actually adds more insult to injury. I mean, so there's a couple issues here. that this 98-year-old woman who was co-owner, of the Marion County Record in Kansas, Joan Meyer, the police literally raided her house and her office. And you can see video footage of her asking the police what they're doing. She's actually cussing them out at one point in the video. This is, an egregious assault, not just on the press, but on this person's civil rights, privacy, human rights. And in fact, at one point, this woman calls them, she says, quote, "These are Hitler tactics and something has to be done." Well, subsequently, turns out there's been a lot of brouhaha about the corruption and the things that led up to this. It's almost like a textbook small town corrupt sheriff business person going after the local newspaper. It's as if you could, it's as if you could have a film about it already. It's so strangely textbook in that regard, which makes it all the more reason that it doesn't dawn on anybody that's violating press freedoms that there are press freedoms and that what they're doing is completely absurd. It's pretty confounding in a lot of ways. What's happening this Marion case. The good news, I think, Eleanor, and want to hear your views about this, is that this case seems to have attracted some attention. It seems to have it's getting some pretty big media coverage, so it isn't one that's been swept under the rug, as the Asheville Blade story, hasn't seemingly gotten a lot of attention. I think maybe some of the more human element of this story, that in fact Joan Meyer died mid-sentence the next day, while she was previously even decrying that this raid would be the death of her. You can't even make it up. It's a tragic story for the Myers, their family. It's a tragic story for the paper and the community. And more broadly, it's a very, very cautionary tale about why we need to be ever vigilant and protect press freedoms, whether it's the Marion County Record, and small local law enforcement abusing their authority, or whether it's the United States government abusing the Espionage Act against, you mentioned, Julian Assange. I see a direct line between these kinds of assaults, and I think it's really important that programs like ours really call attention to this. And I know some listeners say, you all have Assange segments on every month, or so many weeks you're talking about Assange again. Well, that's because this is a really important story that we've been trying to get across to people, that it's actually not really just about him. It's about publishing. It's about journalism. It's about telling the public what's really going on without the fear of reprisal, without governments or corporate entities coming in to censor or retaliate against people that want to tell these very important stories. And in the case of Marion in Kansas, it was, unearthing some corrupt stories about people wanting to keep parts of their past secret, who were owning businesses, applying for liquor licenses, sordid divorce tales. Again, like I said, it's sort of like all the grist for a bad movie, I guess, but one that has an important kernel of a message, and that is, we can't sit idly by and allow authorities to wantonly abuse power to silence people when they're calling out the corruption of both public officials and private businesses, whether it's a small community, whether it's a large metropolitan area, or whether it's the entire world, Eleanor.
And to your point, Mickey, I think that the fact that that Joan died because of this raid has caused it to bubble up to the surface of a national news story. I think also the fact, her age, and the fact that she was the co-owner of this newspaper, which is, I have not looked in deeply to this newspaper, but unlike the Asheville Blade, for instance, it is not a strictly leftist newspaper. I think that the story with the Asheville Blade is easier for corporate media to shove under the table, because they're like, well, that's so not us, because they're leftists and they care about the homeless. They were at an unhoused encampment when they were arrested for trespassing in a public park while being journalists. And so it's easier for corporate media to be like, well, that's just those leftists, who cares? Yeah. But this story doesn't have that. There's no like, oh, she could never be confused with one of us. And of course, with the likes of Assange, it's not like she was uncovering state secrets or uncovering what the largest empire in the history of the world is doing. And so I think that has caused it to bubble up. And I think the other point that's important, you mentioned that people might be thinking, oh, you cover Assange all the time. Well, I think that there's implications beyond press freedoms and beyond the freedom of speech, because the way that this works is they want to stop people from reporting on things that are happening that are either illegal or corrupt, because they want to keep doing those things that then bleed into all aspects of our lives, so that then they can police you more easily without anybody noticing, right? They can force unhoused people into cages. They can force immigrants into cages. They can do all of this without anybody blowing the whistle on them. And so this isn't just about press freedoms, although that is enough of a concern. This is about all of our freedoms, all of our rights, all of our basic human rights. And so I think that is another aspect that should be mentioned for sure, Mickey.
I think absolutely, Eleanor. And, you brought to mind a very important issue that the press freedom issue, as the former FCC commissioner, Nicholas Johnson, would say, the press freedom issue is always your second issue, at the very least. Media reform, media democracy, because if you're not going to protect the press, whatever your first concern, whatever your first area of interest is likely not going to be reported. People aren't going to hear about it. One of the ramifications of the what looks to be the illegal police raid in Marion County in Kansas is that the paper said that it's unclear how they're going to be able to publish the next edition of the newspaper. This comes at a time when we're experiencing extraordinary news deserts in the United States, where small local communities, rural communities, don't have local news sources. Here's an example of the local police shutting down one of the only local news sources in an area, which means it's going to negatively impact all the people in that community that they served, the underserved people in that community already, the already marginalized people in that community are going to be even more detrimentally served, as most studies show. What happens in news deserts is the type of people that are impacted are more from marginalized communities, that their stories aren't told. It's a social injustice issue, as it were. As injustice what happened to folks at the paper, and the unfortunate tragedy of the death of the owner of the paper, Joan Meyer. We also have these other rippling effects, not to mention, how about the chilling effect of the clear shot across the bow that unless we all stand up in solidarity, not just press freedom organizations, but the public in general, other communities will see this and say, well, looks like they might get away with that. The only silver lining in this particular story seems to be that they don't seem to be getting away with it. I mean, they've already gotten away, I guess, with murder, you could argue, in that regard, to stretch that definition. But I take a look at, say, the Press Freedom of the Press Foundation. The director of advocacy there, Seth Stern, said, quote, based on the reporting so far, the police raid of the Marion County Record on Friday, this happened in earlier August, appears to have violated federal law, the First Amendment, basic human decency. Everyone involved should be ashamed of themselves. At other site, and we've talked about this in the program, Andy Roth and I have written about it in the books. Another great site to check out for this is U.S. Press Freedom Tracker. They track these attacks on the press. And again, in the last couple of years, especially after the 2020 George Floyd murder, there was such a huge spike in attacks on journalists, damaging of their equipment, thefts on their equipment, that the United States actually became, according to Reporters Without Borders and the Press Freedom Index, the United States was one of the top 5 most dangerous places for journalists to work in the world. And that sounds riveting, given how much goes on in the rest of the world, right? But I think those are things that should clearly give us pause. And it's cases like these that should really remind us how important the press is, how important it is for us to protect those rights, even if they're not happening in our community, it's happening in some other community, right? Going back to MLK, an injustice against one is an injustice against all. We really need to have this kind of solidarity. And Eleanor, I know you had another case that was an interesting case. Also, Kevin Costola writing about the dissenter, a journalist suing over gag rules at a county jail, Allegheny County Jail in Pennsylvania, just out of Pittsburgh, actually my own stomping grounds. I grew up outside of there. And you have here an example of someone that's a journalist, a professor, someone working with prisoners. Again, already an extraordinary censored topic, underreported topic, very difficult to see prisoners as humans with rights, et cetera, in that regard. And there's a pretty riveting case here where, and this is pretty standard we've seen, but this is a pretty egregious case, that journalists just aren't given access, prisoners aren't able to tell their stories, and people who work at prisons can't blow the whistle and can't talk about extraordinary injustices that take place behind bars. Eleanor, you want to add something about this story? I know the Society of Professional Journalists is already on this case, and they've talked about how these kind of restrictions have been found to be unconstitutional in the past. Eleanor.
Yeah, absolutely, Mickey. And before I get into this, I just want to make those, I like drawing connections and following the red threads through things. So I think what's important to recognize here is the red thread of the police state, right? Because obviously the police state is responsible for that raid in Kansas, which, by the way, any kind of whatever she was purported to have done would have been inappropriate to then raid her house in this manner. But let's just make it clear that police showed up looking for evidence that a reporter had, quote, run an improper computer search.
Which is nonsense, because it's a matter of public record. And the way in which the database works is you have to put the person's name in to obtain the record.
Right.
You know, they had gained information unsolicited about a certain person with this past, and they were simply researching it to record it to see if it was factually accurate. And now people have weighed in on the case, legal matters, and said this was not an illegal search. The police, yes. The reporter, no.
No, but that's my point. It's like, first of all, it was a legal search, but even if it was an illegal search, this reaction, it would be like if somebody walked up to you and said hi, and then you shot them. It's like, what kind of response is that? That is an absolutely absurd response to this. And so you have this police state, this revved up, this juiced up police state response to things of the press freedom nature. And then you also, of course, you mentioned, being in the top 5, which is not a coveted place to be. I recall in the summer after the George Floyd murder that there were people who were shot with rubber bullets who were members of the press. And I was not standing close to them, but this was right outside the White House, which was, I mean, if you wanted a picturesque backdrop for this dystopian reality, then that was it. But there were people who had big letters press across their shirts, and they were shot with rubber bullets by military police right outside of the White House in Washington, D.C. And so this is the state of affairs that then connects, of course, very directly to this issue that's happening in Pennsylvania with journalist Brittany Haler suing a county jail for, quote, strictly enforcing the gag rules against prisoners and the jail's employees and contractors. And Haler rightfully asserts that this violates her constitutional rights to, quote, gather news and receive information from otherwise willing speakers. And I also want to tie this into something that Kevin Gostol also mentions in his book, Guilty of Journalism. This was another thing that happened with Daniel Hale, who is still serving time for being a whistleblower. And that about drones. And his family has basically said that they are not comfortable commenting on the conditions that Daniel is experiencing, because every time they do, there are repercussions against Daniel in jail. So this is the kind of gag laws that are taken against prisoners, of course, specifically against whistleblowers. And Haler that has now sued on those grounds. And I don't know, Mickey, if you want to weigh in and say what you think, how you think this case is going to go.
Well, it's heartening to see once again press freedom organizations springing into action. We would hope to see more of the local papers, the local news institutions themselves decrying this on principle alone. But, it's good to see that the Media Freedom and Information Access Clinic at Yale Law School, Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, RCFP, are on this case. In fact, one of the Reporters Committee local legal initiatives in Pennsylvania, Paula Knudsen-Burke, who is an attorney, said that, quote, when the government prevents employees from speaking truthfully about matters of public concern, it restricts the flow of information to communities and can lead to issues going unreported or underreported. And of course, at Project Censored, that's the exact kind of thing that we're interested in calling attention to. on one level, if something's not reported, the public doesn't even have the opportunity to understand that it was not reported. If it's underreported, then we at least get a chance to see it. We, like in this case with Haler, sorry, we are aware that this is an issue. Of course, anybody that's followed everything from prison gag laws to ag gag laws, which you and I spoke about prior off air, this is the thing. There's ever a movement by people in some form of authority or power to gag people, to silence them. And anytime that's going on, you have to look to see why that is. What are they protecting? They're usually trying to protect some kind of abuse, some kind of illegal behavior, some kind of exploitation, often involving marginalized people, right, who are already struggling and already having many challenges. It also usually shows that these allegedly bonded institutions are violating the public trust, which is exactly what the Fourth Estate is supposed to call out, and exactly why we have free press protections under the First Amendment, so that we, the people, can become meaningfully and factually aware of such injustices, and then be meaningfully civically engaged in our systems to demand that reforms are made and changes are made. These, each and every one of these things, and you and I are only doing a smattering of it. We could probably, but we could probably fill up shows every week going down these lists about these things happening. But I'm happy that we're at least able to call attention to it today more directly, more specifically, in a more deliberate way, because I would hope that folks that listen to us on this program won't just go to the Project Censored org site, but they'll also check out reporters that really care about these issues. And Kevin Costola clearly is one. Shadowproof.com, The Dissenter, his other site. These are really important stories, and I'm afraid that there are more of these stories that go on, Eleanor, all across the country that we do not hear about because they're relegated to local news, or we don't hear about them, as the SPJ said. These are or underreported stories. We don't really get to hear that these things happen, but rest assured they do. And I think that it's important we know about it and we stand together to do something about it. Of course, organizations like ours at Project Censored like to call attention to keep people informed about it. But as I mentioned earlier, Society of Professional Journalists, Press Freedom Tracker, the Freedom of the Press Foundation, these organizations are very important. And if you are interested in press freedom issues, then you might want to check out these places and these sources.
Yeah, absolutely, Mickey. And I want to piggyback on what you mentioned, because I think a lot of times these cases, they don't actually even become cases. Like I myself was down in the swamps of Louisiana reporting on the folks trying to stop the construction of the Bayou Bridge pipeline, which was kind of like the southern end of the Dakota Access Pipeline. And I was basically intimidated by pipeline workers and police who were moonlighting as pipeline security. I wonder how convenient that is, but I was basically intimidated. I was threatened to put down my camera. This is not so I wasn't arrested. So there's no case. There's no paperwork, which in a lot of instances is very convenient for them, right? It's very convenient to not have a paper trail because, oops, what if we got it wrong? But to intimidate someone, to force people either physically or via threats to get off of, an easement or something in the case of a dirty energy project or quote unquote private property. Again, cops can lie to you so they can say you're on this property, you're on that property. And this keeps press from being able to report on issues. And so this is happening constantly, as we're having this conversation. I'm sure it's already happened like a dozen times. But this is the issue with these underreported and unreported aspects that you're talking about. And also to your point of what they hide in this case in Pennsylvania. I just want to share that the complaint that was lodged against this jail in Pennsylvania, it says, quote, incarcerated people and officers alike report frequent sightings of cockroaches, rats, and vermin excrement in and around the food served at the jail. These issues and many others go unreported or underreported because jail employees or contractors are often the only reliable source of information, and the gag rules bar them from talking to reporters.
That's right. They've got to go through the warden. They've got to have everything cleared. It reminds me very militaristically of the embedded reporters that had to be registered with the military and go through the top brass command to tell us what was happening in Iraq. So those stories they're killed before they begin. Either that or it's like a game of telephone. And by the time it starts here and you talk about wanton murder and violation of international law, by the time it gets back to the Pentagon and over to, CNN or Fox News, it's, troops are planting flowers and they're being celebrated, abroad. I mean, again, the propaganda and the types of messaging get totally skewed. Same kind of thing with the prisons. The warden's not going to want bad kind of embarrassing information leaking out to reporters that are trying to hold them accountable. So it's the situation is just ripe for censorship, and it's also ripe to sort of just squelch these concerns. And if folks are interested to see sort of a more of a snapshot of exactly what that you described happening to you in Louisiana, pressfreedomtracker.us is the actual website for Press Freedom Tracker, just so people can get it clear. Press Freedom Tracker US. Just this year, here we are in summer. Just this year, and this is only what they've cataloged. This is only what's been reported. 4 arrests, journalists arrested on criminal charges, 14 assaults, 8 chilling statements, kind of like the one you described, 6 denials of access, 4 incidents of equipment damage, 4 equipment search seizure, 8 random other incidents, 5 prior restraint, and 14 subpoena legal orders. That's according to Press Freedom Tracker. That's just halfway through the year. And that's what's happening in the alleged land of the free under free press protections. Now, some folks may say that's a paltry number. That's a very small number in a country with so many people. But take a look at the significance of these and the ramifications of these. And, in the institution of that fourth estate is relatively small. And those people pay attention to the things that happen to each other and they tell each other things. And guess what? One of the biggest chilling effects and things we never really get to see is self-censorship. How many reporters self-censor because they know a story is going to get killed, or they might get killed, or someone they know might get killed? We saw it in Las Vegas, right? Last year, with a reporter for the Vegas paper being killed by a local politician who was investigating his corruption. This isn't just the stuff of make-believe, right? These things happen, which is why it's also really important that when we see demagogic, sort of characters like Donald Trump talking about the press as the enemy of the people, when they weaponize that kind of language, they're not talking about it the same way media critics do, where we're saying that the public should be more informed, the press should import in the public interest more. That's where the press can harm the public. But these folks just want to have a full-on onslaught that, the press is evil and bad. And even though it's not terribly popular, especially on the left, to protect mainstream institutions of journalism, and Andy Roth and I have said this is the project for a long time, it's important to call out attacks on the press anywhere and everywhere. And it is often the fact, whether we like it or not, that even if, the New York Times peddles lies about WMDs or whatever else, these major institutions have money and legal power that they can support somebody in a court case like James Risen or somebody else, right? They actually have the resources to go to bat. You know who doesn't have resources, Eleanor? You, other independent small journalists, the folks at the Asheville Blade, people like this adjunct professor in Pittsburgh trying to report what's going on in the prisons. That's why they need these institutions to come to their support. And that's why I'll repeat this again. The injury to one is the injury to all. The fact that the major press in this country did not immediately come up in support of Julian Assange and the case against WikiLeaks is a disgrace to the Fourth Estate, and it's a stain on the public record for these journalistic institutions. Many of them have subsequently come up and mea culpa and said, oh, hey, wait a minute. Looks like you're kind of serious about prosecuting this guy as a journalist publisher, and that may not be cool for us because we've won Pulitzers using information that he published while throwing him under the bus. So again, I think this is everyone's issue. This isn't just an issue if you're in Kansas or Pittsburgh or have a family member that's incarcerated or dealing with house situation. This is everybody's issue. Press freedom is everybody's issue. And I do hope that we are able to convey that message on the Project Censored show to people, that's what's behind every single story we do, every story in the book, every episode of the radio program. That's what's driving it. I mean, you may get into the weeds, right, or the forest, as you did in your recent your new documentary, To the Trees. Behind that message is the second priority. It's I wish it would be great if you actually knew about this story, but a lot of people aren't reporting about it. And then that gets into the automatic question of, well, why is that so? Well, the topic of our thread in this, the conversation we're having today, Eleanor, is that there's fear, there's intimidation, there's news deserts. There's a lot of reasons why stories aren't told, and there's a lot of probably good reasons that folks in places like the Marion Record are now scared. I mean, this is a real impact, right? I mean, it might make people angry, it might make people rise up, but somebody died here in Kansas, an elderly woman who was an owner of a local newspaper. That's unconscionable. That must be investigated, and it should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law as an example to set boundaries for law enforcement in abusing First Amendment rights of the press.
Absolutely, Mickey. And with regards to the chilling effect, I mean, when I spoke last to Veronica Coit and Matilda Bliss, Veronica is leaving Asheville and is unclear if they want to continue doing journalism. And I don't blame them. I mean, if I had been found guilty of being a journalist, I don't know that I would want to continue stepping into that space. Like, I don't want to go to jail again. Veronica has children as well. So this is, these are the kind of effects that you don't see that continue to reverberate long past the initial shock of whatever's going on here. And I
agree. And it's interesting to note too, that not long ago, at the White House funnies, the press the correspondence dinner, where comedians get up and roast the press and the politicians and whatnot. Joe Biden took the opportunity to grandstand and take a swipe at Russia and Russia's dismal record on press freedoms about arresting journalists. And Joe Biden actually said with a straight face, journalism is not a crime. Well, Joe, we don't agree on a lot, but on that, I'm right with you, brother. So journalism isn't a crime, Joe Biden. So we should stop treating it like it is one at home when you have one of the most powerful public pulpits from which to decree such a thing, not about what's happening in Russia or even in Ukraine, where there are similar gag orders, right? The democracy of Eastern Europe. Nonsense. Right here in America, we could use a big megaphone coming from the White House, reminding authorities, reminding his own State Department, reminding the CIA, reminding the FBI that journalism is not a crime.
Absolutely, Mickey. And then this goes back to who gets to decide who a journalist is, because I'm sure if pressured on that statement, the response would be, well, Julian Assange is not a journalist. The Asheville Blade reporters are not journalists. I wouldn't be considered a journalist. And here you have that issue. And I think also what we're seeing with regards to these ramped up attacks on journalists is because the U.S. empire worked very hard to ensure that they had stenographers for the State Department vis-a-vis the corporate media. That the New York Times boasts about sending copy to the federal government before it goes to print. They had these people on lock, and then all of a sudden people started getting these little devices, phones and iPads and cameras that you can stick on a helmet, and all of a sudden you've got citizen journalists, and that's really inconvenient because you had just locked down this entire corporate media entity under 4 companies all of a sudden, and now you have got citizen journalists running around, and how are we going to stop them? Well, you stop them by changing the definition of what journalism is, just like
That's
Trump
right.
changed the definition of poverty, and then all of a sudden less people lived in poverty, right? Like, what an easy fix.
Reagan made ketchup a vegetable. Yeah. Amazing things those in power can do with words and language and definitions. This is something that I think we should, and again, we will revisit this. You and I are going to revisit these kinds of analytical segments each month. We're going to try to have a part of a program where you and I kind of cut up the headlines and sort of look behind the headlines at what's going on in the world of journalism itself. Right. And that's one of the things that the corporate media failed to cover very well, and that's themselves. So, Eleanor, I'm delighted that you and I will be able to spend some time shining a light behind their paywalls and into the dark spaces they'd rather we not see, the owners of the alleged public press. Because if they're not going to report about it, somebody does. And somebody needs to stand up for press freedom, and not just for financial incentives, and not just to peddle what sells, but because we need to protect press freedom so that we, the people, are informed about things that are happening and that we can mobilize around them accordingly. Otherwise, the principles, the notions of having a democratic republic are primarily just dead letters. They're a figment, of our projected imaginations. And again, I think that press freedom should be an issue that everyone is concerned about. And I hope some of the information and some of the sites we've shared today might help people get more motivated to look into it, and maybe even look into their own local community, what's going on with their own, if they're lucky enough to have a local newspaper that's not like an AstroTurf pop-up shop, right, or something, but actual local journalists doing real reporting at city council, school boards, etc. Really think about supporting your local paper. You're not supposed to agree with everything they do and everything they write, but you're supposed to support them as a way of being a vehicle for community communication, and a way to have your voice and the voices of others platformed, heard, right? Heard. Go back to Article 19 of the United Nations, the Declaration on Human Rights for press freedom, Article 19. It's not just the right to disseminate information uninhibited, it's the right to be heard. And I think that that's why we need to protect press freedom even more. There's a lot more of these stories, Eleanor, we need to hear about if we're going to do more to protect press freedom.
Absolutely, Mickey. Very well put. And on that note, we'll end it here. Thanks, y'all, so much for listening to the Project Censored Radio Show. And please let us know what you think. Please get in touch with us over at projectcensored.org. You can get all of our radio shows. You can get access to the book and a lot of other goodies there. So, Mickey, thank you. And I'll talk to you next time.
Sounds good.